None of this can be done without dollars and cents and without an economy that is humming along. So we've got not just any old economist, but an absolute rock star economist here to address us all on the important topic of everyone making a fair return. He's the Chief Economist, ANZ and Global Commodities at HSBC. Please welcome Paul Bloxham to the stage.
It's been a perfect storm for the construction industry, at least from a macroeconomic perspective. A Shakespearean tempest. It's been tough, is what I'm saying. Think about what you've been through in the last 4 years. You've been through a pandemic and all the restrictions that brought. You've been through a sharp rise in materials costs. You've been through a lack of availability of labour. There's the energy transition, which has gained momentum, which we're all working on. We've had interest rates go down, and they were going to stay down for a long time. And then they went up, and they've gone up a lot, and they look like they're going to stay there for a while as well. You've got industrial relations changes that are going on in the background, and all of this has had to be absorbed as you've travelled over the past few years. It's been shifting tides and quite a lot of furious wind and a big wave of insolvencies, unfortunately. So it's been a really tough time, I think, for the construction industry over the past few years. And I think if you look back over the past couple of years or through that story of what I've just described briefly, you can explain why we are where we are. And that's what I'm going to try and do. So enough of the poetry. I'm an economist after all. I'm going to speak in prose from here. I'm going to set out for you at least the framework which I use for thinking about how the economy is travelling and how the construction industry fits into it. And, of course, being an economist, I'm going to talk about the demand factors, and then I'm going to talk about the supply factors. And if I think about the demand factors, actually that's less of the story for construction over the past few years. A lot more of the story is about supply. It's a lot more about supply constraints, materials costs, adjustments in the economy that have needed, productivity, which got discussed at the last session as well, and what's been going on in terms of that lack of productivity growth. It's a lot more supply driven. But if we think back over the past few years, the demand side, let's start there. Well, demand got a few shocks as well. The pandemic came along and frightened everyone, and demand weakened for a short period, but not for long, actually, if you think about it. Because quite quickly the RBA responded and interest rates went down a lot, and the government responded and launched a whole lot of programs to spend money, and interest rates were extraordinarily low, so state governments kept running on that demand story for infrastructure. Demand actually held up reasonably well. One of the big things that we were fearful of, economists through the pandemic, was that the shutting of the border would constrain the number of people and we'd have less housing demand and maybe we'd have a housing oversupply. But as it turned out, there was a really big shift in behaviour. Everyone shifted to working, well, a lot of people shifted to working from home. They needed more space. And so what we saw was that excess supply in the housing market was kind of absorbed. So demand actually held up reasonably well. And then we got to the end of the pandemic and we reopened our economy and actually demand started to surge in a broad sense for the economy. It delivered inflation, which delivered the RBA lifting its interest rate as much as it has. From the construction perspective, that demand just continued. It was just basically there. We hadn't invested in infrastructure for many years, so those projects have continued to go through. The housing story, well, actually, when we reopened the border, we got a massive surge in inward migration, which forced up demand for housing. The only areas where demand have looked a bit weaker are for areas like office property, where, in essence, people are working from home more, so they don't need as much office space. So there's lower occupancy rates in offices, and there's obviously more demand for housing. But from a construction perspective, demand has actually held up reasonably well in that overall picture. It's been the smoother of the two forces. But from a supply perspective, it's been very tricky. When the pandemic first came along, you had all the pandemic-related restrictions which really disrupted things. Clearly, you had all of these. You've got the industry operates a lot in fixed-price contracts, and so when the materials costs went up quite sharply and the labour became in shorter supply, it became very difficult because the cost of doing business went up pretty quickly. Now, what we also had through that period of time, of course, was a lot of forbearance. We had policymakers taking a lot of action to make sure that although costs had gone up, materials costs had gone up, and although labour was in short supply and the cost base had gone up, we'd put in place all these measures to keep the economy in a deep freeze, right? Remember? We put in place JobKeeper to keep everyone in the same jobs. We put in place moratoria on corporate insolvencies to keep, well, all firms around, even the weak ones. We put in place tax repayment holidays. The tax department was happy to take a holiday from getting your taxes. We put in place mortgage repayment holidays in some cases. There was a massive amount of forbearance, and then added to all of that, there was government support in a direct form, in fiscal support, and also interest rates were very, very low, of course. They'd been cut to very, very low rates as well. So massive amounts of forbearance, which meant that even though you faced all of these supply-side shocks at the initial stages of the pandemic in the early period in 2020, 2021, and even into early 2022, the economy didn't actually adjust to any of that. It didn't need to, because we had all this forbearance that had put the economy into a deep freeze for that 2-year period. And so then you fast forward to when we reopened. We reopened the economy. We got a surge in demand for housing in particular. We didn't have a particularly large amount of housing supply. And of course, demand for construction in general was actually still running pretty strongly. But the supply side was pretty gummed up. And it was partly gummed up because, well, we'd put in place all of these measures to protect the economy, to put it into a deep freeze, to see that there was no change, and to protect all of the parts of the economy. But then, of course, when you took away all of that forbearance, the tax department started to want all of its taxes paid, and interest rates went up as well, and JobKeeper, well, it went to the background, and government stopped spending all this money. Then, at that point, obviously, we started to see a rise in insolvencies, because a lot of the operators who had previously survived through that period of time with all the forbearance, well, it turned out that those fixed price contracts weren't profitable anymore, and so a lot of them started to fall over, and that has delivered a large rise, as you know, in insolvencies in the construction industry, in fact, across the economy. In fairness, insolvencies through the pandemic fell to less than half their normal rate, because that makes sense. Well, there was a moratoria on corporate insolvencies. And what we've seen recently, in large part, is catch-up, actually. We haven't quite gotten back even to the trend in corporate insolvencies as across the whole nation. But nonetheless, the adjustment is that would have happened early in the experience of facing those higher costs and facing that labour shortage and facing all that disruption. It was delayed. It was delayed for a couple of years, and it really didn't start to come through until we got to late 22 into 2023, and that's what we're facing right now. We're still working through the pandemic-related long tail effects that are disrupting parts of the industry, large parts of the industry, and I think that's one of the things that's gumming up the capacity of this industry at this stage to deliver as much. So where we land at the moment is in a position where demand is holding up reasonably well. It is holding up reasonably well, but the cost of doing business is still very high because we're still adjusting to those effects that came through from earlier. We've still got an industry that's adjusting and still quite gummed up by all of that. And of course, the costs rising at the same time that you're still working through adjusted behaviour and trying to make productivity lift, and that's leaving you with an industry that's really struggling to deliver. So if I come back as a macroeconomist to the fundamentals that I look at, I go, we reopened the economy, we got a surge in demand across the economy. Actually, construction demand held up reasonably well as well, in part because we got a lot more people coming in, and so we had a lot more housing demand. And the infrastructure pipeline, although it slowed a little bit, it's actually still quite hefty, so there's quite a lot going on there. The only space that's really a bit softer is the office property space. The rest of it's holding up, so demand's holding up. But at the same time, we've had to make all these supply adjustments that were sort of delayed. They were very much delayed by all the policy measures that were delivered. And so where you land with all of that is demand in the economy as a whole, I might add, is still growing ahead of supply in the economy's ability to deliver. But in the construction industry specifically, I think you can really see that that is one of the clear areas where the supply side is still constrained enough that we're not able to match the amount of demand that's out there. We're still going through all of that adjustment. You all operate and work in businesses, and economists, when they think about where we're at and try to think about inflation, which is what I'm hinting at, inflation's coming down slowly, it's still elevated, the cost base is still rising a bit too quickly. When we think about modelling inflation, one of the main models we use is something called a markup model. a markup model of inflation. It's the way that, and the idea of this is to replicate, roughly speaking, what businesses do. So a stylised business would operate in this sort of way. They would say to themselves, look, here's my cost base, it grows at a certain rate. Each year I'd like to lift my prices in line with my cost base, and that will maintain my profit margin and keep my owner or my shareholders happy, and that's a markup over your cost base. And that's kind of how you roughly operate in terms of thinking about things. Okay, so with that in mind, if you look at a national level for the whole economy and you look at what's going on in terms of that story, prior to the pandemic, between 2014 and 2020, what we had in the economy in broad terms was wages growth that used to run at an average of about 2% a year. Right? Wages, labour, workers, that's the primary input in terms of your cost base. The workers and how much they produce. How much you pay them and then how much they produce. Between 2014 and 2020, wages growth averaged about 2% a year. And over that same period, 2014 through 2020, labour productivity was growing at about 1%. That was about what we used to get. And economists used to whinge and complain and say 1% productivity growth is very weak and it's much weaker than it used to be and we should do more about it, we should lift productivity, but it was positive, right? It was 1%. You pay your workers 2% more each year, you get 1% more out of them, your cost base is rising by 1% a year. Your unit labour costs are rising by 1% a year. And so comfortably, reasonably comfortably, if you lift your prices every year by 1% a year, you roughly speaking maintain your profit margin. And this was happening across the whole economy. I'm not describing this as one particular industry, but this was the national economic story. And the RBA, who target 2.5% inflation, were struggling to get inflation to hit 2.5% because, of course, everyone was lifting their prices by 1% or 1.5%. And we were averaging about 1.5% inflation in that period. Fast forward to now, to where we are at the tail end of the pandemic. Well, wages growth now rises at 4% a year. Why is it rising at 4% a year? Well, we disrupted the labour market through the pandemic. We shut the border. The unemployment rate fell. It's been at an extraordinarily low. At the end of 2022, it was at its lowest level in 50 years at 3.5%. And now it's lifted a little bit. It's at 4.1%, but that's still an exceptionally low unemployment rate. So wages growth has gone from running at 2% to now running at 4%. It now runs at 4% a year, and that's where we're at. But at the same time, and this is the problem, of course, productivity has been much weaker than it was. In fact, the pandemic did all of this disruption that I just described, and so productivity in levels actually fell. It fell 5% from when it peaked in early 2022. It's difficult to measure this stuff, so you can't be too precise, but what you know is if it's falling rather than rising, then it's not a good story. Productivity is starting to look a little bit more stable just in the last little while, but the last print that we got for productivity tells us that productivity growth over the past year in Australia was 0, right? So let's go back to my little arithmetic. My little arithmetic says you're paying wages rises at the moment of 4%, but you're getting no more productivity, and so you want to lift your prices each year by 4% a year across the economy, not just in construction. And in parts of construction, productivity is even weaker and wages growth is even stronger. So in fairness, this is me describing the macro economy, but that's still a problem. The problem is if productivity is 0 and wages growth is 4 and you need to lift your prices by 4% a year, well, the RBA is not going to get its inflation target at 2.5%, is it? And so this is where we land. We land with an economy at the moment in aggregate where demand has slowed down. The RBA has lifted its policy rate to slow down the economy, and it is slowing a bit, but it's only slowing a bit. We haven't tipped into a recession. It's slowed down a bit. And the problem we have is that the supply side of our economy, the ability of it to deliver, to match that demand, has been quite constrained. Productivity's been pretty weak, and the supply side's been gummed up. It's been gummed up by a lot of the pandemic-related factors that came into play and the fact that the economy is still adjusting to this new world, having removed all of those forbearance measures, including JobKeeper. And it's also adjusting to the fact that, well, we shut the border for 2 years. We didn't get people coming here, and reopening it is working. We're getting people in, but it's taking time for the labour market to work its way through and to operate more efficiently. And so demand has slowed, but supply is not catching up yet, and that is leaving us with inflation that is still running at the moment a bit high. It's still running at 3.9% on the RBA's measure, and that's why earlier this week they said don't think that rate cuts are coming anytime soon. They're not coming anytime soon because inflation's still too high. Now that little model I described to you in the last minute that I've got also tells us the solution. It tells us how we fix this. Well, there are 3 ways. One, you get a squeeze in profit margins. You might already be feeling that a bit. Across the economy, I think we are seeing a bit of a squeeze in profit margins, but that doesn't happen for very long before businesses start saying, hold on a moment, my owner or my shareholders are not going to be very happy, so I have to do something about this. And what do? They start focusing on their cost base. Now, the normal way that you go about trying to lower your cost base in previous cycles is by starting to hire a few less workers, or maybe starting to lay off a few workers, but we've still got an economy that's operating at approximately full capacity, so that's kind of not happening that much. So there are sort of two other solutions. We either slow down wages growth, which is tricky to do in an economy which still hasn't got enough workers, it's still got a tight labour market, or we get labour productivity to lift. What we want, ideally, is to lift labour productivity. And what do we need to make that happen? Well, we need, ideally, policy support, tax reform. We need to look carefully at the changes we're making for industrial relations. All these things are important, but ultimately, productivity doesn't come from policy. It doesn't come from governments. It comes from the way you operate businesses. It's whether you adopt new techniques, whether you you train up your workers more. It comes from whether you apply more capital and more technology, find a better way to do things. This is where the productivity ultimately comes from. We need productivity to lift in order to improve our living standards, but actually right at this moment, the other reason we need productivity to lift is because it will help bring inflation down, and that will eventually help the RBA to be able to start taking its foot off the brake. It's still got its foot on the brake on the economy right now. It can't do that until we get inflation starting to come down a bit more. You've been through a perfect storm. I think it's going to take a little while longer for us to work our way through this, is what I'm describing. There's still a few more adjustments to come, but I think the economy and the construction industry come 12 to 18 months will have worked through a lot of those pandemic-related disruptions, and things will start to look a bit brighter then. I think things are still a bit tough for the moment.
Yeah, please. One quick question for you.
Thanks, Adam.
I am mindful of time, but I always love picking your brains. A couple of days ago, there were a couple of days in a row, there was a little bit of a blip on the stock market. There was a significant drop in Australia. I think the worst day since 2022. Japan, worse since the GFC, dropped like 10 or 12%. Got most of it back the next day, and things seem to have calmed down. So, 6 months from now, do we look back at those couple of days and go, that was a bit of fun, wasn't it? Or do we go, how on earth did we not see that the global economy was about to explode?
I think it'll be the first one. I don't think this is the beginning of the global economy exploding, which is fair. I think that what we've got is a few features. The global economy is slowing down. The US economy is slowing down. It should be. They lifted interest rates and they lifted them a lot, and we hadn't seen much of a slowdown. We're now starting to see a bit of a slowdown. But we don't think there's a recession coming. It's a slowdown. The market kind of got ahead of itself in that. And then the other thing that's been playing out that you kind of sort of articulated is that, for the first time in decades, interest rates are going up in Japan. For the first time in decades. I mean, they lifted interest rates this last week, and the week about 3 months earlier, they'd lifted them for the first time since 2007. And with interest rates having been dead flat, minus negative, and now starting to rise, the market is going, hold on a moment, you've got all this public debt. What's going to happen? And so it does make sense that the yen moves around a lot, that the carry trade that happens unwinds. And so there's a lot of disruptive forces and a lot of uncertainty that's coming around that. I don't think this is the beginning of a really big downturn. I think this is a lot of positioning that got shifted all at once.
One final very, very quick observation just on that when we saw that Bitcoin drop big at the moment. Are you more Bitcoin, Ether, Solano, Doge? Where's HSBC putting all its buckets of money in the crypto space?
Not in the crypto space.
There we go. Okay, give me a big round of applause. Thank you very much, Paul Bloxham. As always, fascinating stuff. Chief Economist, HSBC. Woo!